The property, she said quietly, was transferred to Ms. Eleanor Margaret Holt 6 months ago. Any subsequent sale agreement is null and void. My Uncle Richard's face went the color of old ash. My Aunt Patricia dropped her phone. It clattered against the marble floor and no one moved to pick it up. The buyer's attorney, a young man in an expensive suit who had until that moment looked extremely confident, became suddenly very interested in the grain of the table. And my grandmother, 81 years old, sitting beside me in her good blue coat with her hands folded in her lap, reached over and patted my hand without a word. She'd known all along. She had planned this moment with the quiet precision of someone who has lived long enough to understand that protection is not something that arrives from outside. It is something you build, carefully, before you need it. But I should start from the beginning, because the beginning matters. The beginning is where you'd find me completely blind to everything that was coming. Living my ordinary life, believing my family was a family. Convinced that the old house on Sycamore Lane was just a house and not the thing they'd been plotting around for years like wolves circling a fire. The beginning is where I was still making excuses and giving benefit of the doubt and choosing the most charitable interpretation available, because that is what you do when the alternative requires you to believe something about people you love that you are not ready to believe. My name is Eleanor, Ellie to most people. I'm 34 years old. I teach high school English, which means I spend 8 hours a day parsing intent from language, reading between the lines, catching what students try to hide behind what they actually write. I'm good at it. Professionally. Personally, it took me far too long. I kept giving people the benefit of the doubt when the doubt was enormous and staring me in the face with its hands on its hips. My grandmother is Dorothy Holt, née Brannigan. She has lived in the same white clapboard house on Sycamore Lane for 53 years. She raised 4 children in that house. My father James, my Uncle Richard, my Aunt Patricia, who married into the family name, and my Aunt Carol, who died of cancer 11 years ago, and is not a part of this story, except in the way that her absence shaped everything that happened after. Carol was the one who would have seen it coming. Carol was the one who understood Richard with the particular clarity that sometimes only comes from siblings, who never believed the warm voice was the whole story, who said once at a family dinner, I must have been 12 or 13, that Richard would sell anything if the price was right. She said it lightly, as a joke, and everyone laughed because it was also true, and no one examined it further because the truth was wearing its most comfortable clothes. After Carol died, there was no one left at the table who would say out loud the things that needed to be said. Dorothy taught piano lessons in the front room for 30 years. She grew tomatoes in the back garden that were so good the neighbors came with jars. She kept a calendar on the kitchen wall where she wrote birthdays in red marker and crossed off days leading up to Christmas like a child counting down. She is the kind of woman who still sends thank you notes by hand, who calls you on your actual birthday and not just posts on your wall, who remembers that you mentioned in passing 6 months ago that you were worried about your students' reading scores and asks you at Sunday dinner how that turned out. She is precise and warm and funny in the dry way of people who have spent a lifetime watching human beings closely and drawing careful conclusions. She told me once that the secret to teaching piano to children is the same as the secret to teaching anything. You have to be more interested in what they're doing than in what you wish they were doing. I thought about that often in my own classroom. I think about it still. I live 20 minutes from her house. I visited every Sunday. This was not an obligation. It was the best part of my week, without question, without competition. We ate lunch together, and she told me stories about the neighborhood when it was young, about my father as a boy, about her own mother and the way things used to be done. Sometimes we watched old movies in the afternoon. Sometimes I helped with the garden. She was still sharp, still funny, still in possession of opinions she was not shy about sharing. She had a particular gift for summarizing people's characters in a single sentence, delivered with such perfect mildness that it took you a moment to realize she'd just taken someone apart at the seams. She did this, I realized later, not out of cruelty but out of accuracy. She was committed to accuracy. She had lived too long to waste words on comfortable imprecision. My Uncle Richard visited about 3 times a year. He lived 45 minutes away, which is nothing. I know because I drove it twice in a day sometimes. But he was busy. He was always busy. He ran a residential property management company, had done for 20 years, and he spoke about real estate the way some men speak about weather. Constantly as the backdrop to everything, as the lens through which the world was most usefully understood. He was not an unkind man, exactly. He was a transactional one. Every conversation eventually arrived at an exchange of value. Every relationship was also a ledger, though he'd arranged the ledger so neatly inside his warmth that you had to know where to look before you could find it. His wife, Patricia, was the kind of woman who called herself a free spirit while being exquisitely attentive to everyone else's obligations. She wore flowing scarves and spoke about energy and authenticity, and showed up to family events 40 minutes late with a bottle of wine that she'd clearly grabbed from her own cabinet. She was unfailingly charming in company and unfailingly cutting in private. She had names for people. Dorothy was the old dear, my father was St. James, I was the school teacher, delivered with the faintest curl of something that never quite became a smile. She was the kind of person who made you feel, when she was being warm, that her warmth was a gift she chose to give you, and you felt grateful for it without quite understanding why gratitude was the appropriate response. My father, James, was the oldest. He was a quiet man, careful and steady, who had retired 2 years earlier from his accounting practice and spent his time now reading history books and tending a very serious vegetable garden of his own. He and Dorothy spoke on the phone every Tuesday evening, without fail, for as long as I could remember. He drove her to her doctor's appointments. He fixed things in the house when they needed fixing. He was not demonstrative. He had inherited his mother's talent for letting action speak while keeping emotion close. But his love for her was so constant and so matter-of-fact that it was like the furniture. You stopped noticing it because it was always, simply, there. He knew Richard. He had known Richard for 60 years. I understood later that he knew what Richard was capable of and had been watching with a particular quiet watchfulness that he hadn't known how to name until it was named for him. And then there was me, Dorothy's eldest grandchild, the only one who lived close enough to see her regularly, the one she'd taught to make pie crust and to read music, the one she'd driven to the library every Saturday for 6 years of my childhood because my parents both worked weekends back then, and she believed absolutely in libraries. She'd pressed books into my hands my whole life, not assigned them, pressed them, the way you press something precious, something you want someone else to keep. She'd pressed me with the same devotion, attentive, expectant, full of a confidence in me that I was always trying to grow into. The house on Sycamore Lane was 3 bedrooms, a porch that ran the whole front length, a kitchen with a window above the sink that looked out over the back garden, and more history in its walls than I could have counted. It smelled like wood smoke and something faintly floral that I never could identify. Something Dorothy wore, or something in the old wallpaper, or just the particular smell of a home that has been lived in devotedly for half a century. The piano in the front room still had a pile of beginner's sheet music on the bench from the last lesson she'd given, years ago, and she'd left it there, not out of sentimentality exactly, but because she saw no reason to move it. The kitchen table had a scratch along one end from where my grandfather had set down something heavy during a renovation 20 years ago. The garden in summer was extravagant and slightly unruly. It was not a grand house. It was not worth very much in the abstract figures of the market. But it was irreplaceable in the way that certain things are irreplaceable not because they are rare, but because they are specific. Specific to a person, to a relationship, to a whole portion of your life that you are not the same person without. The trouble began, though I didn't recognize it as trouble at the time, at Christmas 2 years ago. Richard and Patricia came for the holiday, which they sometimes did and sometimes didn't, depending on arrangements that were never quite explained. There was the usual excellent meal, the usual conversation about nothing and everything. And then after dinner, while I was helping Dorothy wash up in the kitchen, I heard Richard and Patricia talking in the dining room in the particular low, clipped way that meant they were being careful. I couldn't make out the words over the water and the clatter of dishes. Dorothy was telling me about a new dahlia variety Agnes next door had ordered, and the extraordinary competitive spirit with which Agnes approached her garden, and I was laughing, and I forgot about the low voices entirely. What I noticed and filed away without quite examining was that Richard asked Dorothy at one point during dessert whether she'd thought about practical matters. He said it easily, warmly, like it was a natural subject, like it was just sensible grown-up conversation about the future. Dorothy said she had everything in order, thank you, and changed the subject to whether the Christmas cookies had come out right this year. Patricia watched Dorothy when she said that, with an expression I caught for only a second before her face rearranged itself into pleasantness. It was the expression of someone calculating. I noticed it and thought, Patricia is a bit intense tonight. And then I thought about nothing in particular because there was cranberry sauce to pass, and my father was telling a story about his garden, and it was Christmas, and the house smelled like wood smoke, and it seemed wrong to bring anything uncomfortable into that light. February of the following year, Dorothy fell on the back porch. Nothing broken, nothing serious, but she was bruised and shaken, and she called me first, before anyone, which I didn't think to examine because of course she did. I was 20 minutes away and she knew I'd come immediately. I came immediately. I helped her inside and made tea and sat with her for 3 hours while she rested. And she kept saying she was fine, perfectly fine, just a little embarrassed. And I kept saying she had nothing to be embarrassed about, and she said it wasn't exactly embarrassment, but didn't finish the sentence. I didn't push it. I thought she meant the vulnerability of needing help. Later, I understood she meant something else. A first hint of a recognition she wasn't ready to put into words. Some peripheral awareness of how this fall might be used. How the people who had been circling might use a fall as justification. She called her doctor herself the next morning. She went to the appointment with my father. She was given a clean bill of health with a recommendation to add a handrail on the porch steps, which she had installed within the week. She supervised the installation personally, chose the style of bracket, insisted on the particular paint color. If there was going to be a handrail, it was going to be a proper handrail, was the attitude, and it was. But the fall rippled outward. Richard called my father that same week. Richard and Patricia drove out to see Dorothy the following Saturday, which I happened to know because Dorothy mentioned it at our usual Sunday visit. Mentioned it the way she sometimes mentioned things that surprised her, as a weather report rather than a headline. Richard came by last Saturday, she said while we were eating lunch. He and Patricia, they walked around the house a bit. I looked up from my soup. Walked around? Outside mostly. Patricia took some photographs, she said for memories. Dorothy was looking at her spoon. She brought flowers, that was nice of her. I said it was nice and kept eating. I didn't ask why Patricia was photographing the exterior of the house for memories. I didn't ask why Richard, who had visited 3 times in the previous year, had come the week after the fall specifically to walk around the outside. I should have. I tell myself now that the information was there, and I chose not to assemble it, which is the generous version. The less generous version is that I understood somewhere beneath my conscious mind that assembling it would require me to think badly of people I was still trying to think well of. 3 months later, in May, Dorothy's neighbor called me. Her name was Agnes. She had lived next door for 30 years, she was 84, and she planted dahlias every spring with a ferocity that Dorothy said bordered on the competitive. Agnes called me on a Tuesday evening and said carefully that she'd had some concerns she wanted to mention. A man came by last week, Agnes said. A real estate agent, I believe. He walked around the property with Richard. He had a clipboard. I stood very still in my kitchen. The refrigerator hummed. I could feel the cold of the tile floor through my socks, precise and clarifying. Did Dorothy know he was there? I asked. That's what I was wondering, Agnes said. Her lights were on. She seemed to be home, but she didn't come out. I thanked Agnes and sat down at my kitchen table and stayed there for a while. My coffee went cold. The streetlight outside my window clicked on while I was sitting there. I told myself there could be explanations. That Richard might be having preliminary conversations, contingency planning, responsible financial thinking about the future. That it was premature to feel the cold, slow dread settling in my chest like weather moving in off a lake. But I called Dorothy that night and asked, as casually as I could manage, how things were going. She said fine. Fine. I asked if Richard had been by recently. She paused. Just a beat, just one beat too many. And said, oh yes, he'd stopped in briefly. I said, what did you talk about? And she said, oh, nothing much. How she was feeling. The usual. And that pause that lasted perhaps half a second longer than normal, in a woman who was never imprecise, told me everything I'd been refusing to hear. I went to see her on Wednesday, not Sunday, which was unusual enough that she noticed. She came to the door already knowing something was coming. She stepped back to let me in with the expression of someone who had been expecting a conversation they'd hoped to postpone. She made tea without being asked and sat across from me at the kitchen table and folded her hands and looked at me steadily. Outside, her back garden was bright with early summer light. The tomato plants she'd staked the week before stood in their row like small, earnest volunteers. "Tell me," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she told me. Richard had been talking about the house. He thought it would be sensible for her to move somewhere more manageable. He'd mentioned several assisted living communities. Good ones, he emphasized. Very well regarded, lots of activities, people her own age. He said the house was too large for one person. He said the upkeep would only become more difficult. He mentioned the market conditions, unprompted, twice. He had asked most recently during a phone call the previous week whether she'd given any more thought to signing some papers, a power of attorney for property decisions. Just prudent planning. Just something to have in place. He said he'd handle everything, that she shouldn't worry about the details. He said these things warmly and with what appeared to be genuine concern. He's had a real estate agent come to the property, Dorothy said. He didn't introduce the man. He said he was just an old friend, someone he was showing the neighborhood to. She paused. I've been watching him for 20 years. I know when he's working. The cold in my chest had become something more specific, a particular tight anger that I kept very still, very controlled, because getting angry in this kitchen was not what the moment required. Have you signed anything? I asked. No, Dorothy said. I have not. She looked at me with those clear, quiet eyes that had seen 60 years of him, 60 years of everything. I'm not confused, Ellie. I know what it means when someone wants you to sign away the right to your own home. I reached across the table and covered her hands with mine. The kitchen smelled like wood smoke and that faint floral thing, and the afternoon light made the room golden, and I had the sudden, fierce, almost overwhelming sense of what it would mean to lose this. Not just the house, not just the wood and plaster and garden, but this specific thing, this light, this smell, this woman across from me with her folded hands and her clear eyes and her 60 years of knowing who she was and what she would and would not tolerate. What do you want to do? I asked. She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a car passed on the street. The refrigerator clicked on. I want to stay in my home, she said. I want to die in my home as your grandfather died in his home, as I have always intended. I am not demented. I am not incapable. I am 81 years old and I fell once on the porch and now there is a handrail and the matter is resolved. She paused. I would like someone to help me make sure it stays resolved. Then that's what we'll do, I said. I drove home that evening and sat at my desk and looked up estate attorneys. I made notes. I made appointments. And while I was doing that, while I was building the first careful structure of what was going to become our defense, I was also, without quite admitting it to myself, assembling everything I'd filed away and refused to examine. The low voices at Christmas, Patricia photographing the exterior, the real estate agent with his clipboard, the power of attorney papers Richard was pushing toward. The picture that assembled itself was not ambiguous. It had clean, terrible lines. The attorney's name was Margaret Osei. She practiced family and estate law from an office on the 3rd floor of a brick building downtown, an office that was cluttered with files and absolutely precise in its thinking. She wore reading glasses on a chain, and she had the manner of someone who had heard every possible human grievance and classified it without losing the capacity to take each one seriously. She charged well and was worth every penny, and I felt the moment I sat across from her desk that I had brought the right kind of mind to bear on the right kind of problem. Dorothy and I sat across from her on a Thursday afternoon. Dorothy had dressed carefully, as she always dressed carefully for things that mattered, a gray wool skirt and her good earrings. And I watched Dorothy explain the situation with the same clear directness she brought to everything. She was not dramatic about it. She stated the facts as she understood them. The pressure, the conversations, the real estate agent who was not introduced as a real estate agent, the power of attorney papers she had been asked to sign. Margaret Osei listened without interrupting and took notes with a very good pen. Has he presented the power of attorney papers again since you initially declined? He called last week, Dorothy said. He was very warm about it. He said he only wanted to make sure I was protected. He said I shouldn't worry about the details. He said he'd handle everything. She paused. He has said, I'll handle everything 3 times now. The repetition has not been reassuring. Margaret made a note. What are your intentions regarding the property long term? Dorothy was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I intend to leave it to my granddaughter. I have intended this for some years. I should have formalized it sooner, but I didn't like to think about it. I'm thinking about it now. I looked at her. She didn't look back, kept her gaze on Margaret Osei. I had not known this. She had not told me. I sat with the weight of it. Margaret Osei looked up from her notepad and looked at Dorothy for a moment with the expression of someone who is recalibrating in real time. Then let's make it formal, she said. Today, if you're ready. What happened in that office over the following 3 hours was careful and thorough and legal and completely unambiguous. Dorothy transferred the property on Sycamore Lane to me by deed of gift. Not in her will, in the present. An immediate transfer, recorded with the county, witnessed, notarized. She retained the right of occupancy for her lifetime. I had no intention of ever exercising ownership in any practical sense during her lifetime. The house was hers, and would be hers for every day she lived. But on paper, as of that Thursday afternoon, it was mine. Had been mine from the moment she signed. I had no idea this was coming. She had planned it without telling me, had made her decision and kept it close, had waited until she had legal counsel present to present it as a completed fact rather than a suggestion I might have argued with. She was right. I would have argued. I would have told her it wasn't necessary, that I could protect her without the transfer, that it felt like too much. She knew me well enough to know that. So she didn't tell me until the moment was right. Driving home, I kept looking at the documents in the seat beside me at stoplights. I felt something enormous and complicated sitting in my chest that I couldn't fully name. Gratitude, yes. A kind of awe at her quiet decisiveness, at the way she had seen what was needed and moved toward it without fuss. But also something that felt uncomfortably like grief, because for this to be necessary, something had already gone wrong. Something that could not be unwrong. I did not call Richard. Margaret Osei advised keeping the transfer confidential. There is no advantage to announcing it, she said. If his plan requires an uninformed seller, the moment he discovers the information, the plan collapses. Let it collapse at a time of your choosing, not his. I sat with that instruction and I kept it. I went back to my regular Sundays. I sat in Dorothy's kitchen and ate lunch and helped with the garden and watched old movies. Everything was the same except for the papers filed with the county clerk's office and the very quiet, very constant awareness behind my sternum that something was moving towards something else, and I could not yet see all the edges of it. The next 3 months were a specific kind of waiting. Not dread exactly, something more like vigilance. I started keeping notes on my phone, dates of calls, things that were said, anything that seemed to be part of a pattern. I am an English teacher. I understand that you find meaning by accumulating detail, by reading the same text multiple times until you can see not just what it says, but what it's trying not to say. Richard called Dorothy twice during those months, both times warmly, both times eventually arriving at the house, at the market, at the future, at how much peace of mind she'd have. She reported these calls to me with the flat accuracy of a court reporter. She liked Richard, in the way you can like someone you also don't trust, can hold 2 contradictory true things about a person simultaneously without confusion. She had known him for 60 years. She knew exactly what he was doing. He's very good at it, she said once with something almost like professional appreciation. He never says the thing directly. He arranges the world around the thing and waits for you to conclude it yourself. He always was like that as a boy. He was the same way about getting out of chores. He'd never refuse outright. He'd arrange circumstances until refusing became someone else's idea. She paused. Your grandfather used to say Richard could sell you your own umbrella. He meant it admiringly. He'd have felt differently if he'd seen it aimed at a family member. In August, Dorothy called me on a Monday evening, not our usual Sunday, not our usual time, and said that a man had knocked on her door that afternoon and introduced himself as a real estate agent who was preparing to list the property. He had been polite and professional and apparently quite confused when Dorothy told him that she was not interested in listing the property and that she had not authorized anyone to do so on her behalf. He had shown her a contact sheet with Richard's name on it. She had thanked him for his time and closed the door. She called me with this information in a voice of absolute, deliberate calm, the way she described things she had already processed and categorized and was now presenting as evidence rather than experience. The processing, I understood, had already happened. She was not calling me in distress. She was calling me to say, here is the next piece. What do you want to do with it? I called Margaret Osei the next morning. She said, document it. Write down the date, the time, the agent's name, everything Dorothy remembered of the conversation. Which I did, which we filed. September arrived and brought a call that changed everything's shape. I was at school, in my classroom during a free period, grading papers with my second cup of coffee going warm at my elbow, when my phone rang. Unfamiliar number. Teacher rule, personal calls during school hours go to voicemail. But something made me pick up. Some quality of instinct, or perhaps just the coincidence that I'd been thinking about Dorothy that afternoon. Thinking about her in the particular way you think about someone when you know something difficult is coming, and you can't see its exact shape yet. Ms. Holt? A man's voice, businesslike and pleasant. My name is Daniel Archer. I'm a real estate agent. I'm calling in reference to the property at 44 Sycamore Lane. I've been engaged to list the property, and I'm trying to reach the current owner to go over next steps. The coffee in my mouth became something flat and mineral. I set the cup down very carefully. You're trying to reach the owner? I said. Yes, a Mrs. Dorothy Holt. We've had some difficulty reaching her directly. She doesn't seem to have email, and Mr. Richard Holt asked that I try the contacts he provided. He listed you as her granddaughter. I looked at the stack of essays on my desk. A student's handwriting moved in and out of focus. I noticed distantly that the red pen I'd been holding had stopped moving. And you've spoken with Richard about this listing, I said. Extensively, yes. He has the power of attorney for property decisions. The pen dropped from my hand. Or no. I set it down, deliberately, though I don't remember doing it. I was somewhere very still and very cold inside, the way you get when you've suspected something for a long time and it has just become real. Richard had a power of attorney. Richard claimed to have a power of attorney. Dorothy had never signed one. I knew this with certainty. Dorothy knew this with certainty. She had told me directly, I have not signed any document relating to this property. So, if Richard had a power of attorney with Dorothy's signature on it, there was only one explanation. Mr. Archer, I said, and my voice was steady in the way you make your voice steady by sheer, conscious effort, like pressing a hand flat against something in order to keep it from moving. I think there may be some significant confusion about the ownership status of this property. I would strongly encourage you not to take any action until you've verified the current recorded deed with the county clerk's office. A pause. I'm sorry? The county clerk's office, I said. I gave him the address, which I had memorized without knowing I'd memorized it. Check the recorded deed before you proceed with anything. I'm asking you to do that. I hung up and sat without moving for a moment. Then I called Margaret Osei. She answered on the second ring. I told her what had just happened, concisely, in the order it had occurred. She was quiet while I talked with the particular quality of silence that means someone is thinking quickly and precisely. When I finished, she said, Power of attorney. He claims to have power of attorney for the property. He claims to have it. Dorothy never signed one. Dorothy never signed one. A pause, shorter, more decisive. Then we have a very serious problem, she said. Come in tomorrow morning, both of you. I sat in my empty classroom after I hung up and looked at the essays on my desk and did not grade them. The afternoon light came through the windows at a low angle. I thought about Richard walking around the exterior of Sycamore Lane with a man on a clipboard. I thought about Patricia with her camera, photographing the house for memories. I thought about all the warm phone calls and the gentle urgency and the way he'd arranged everything around the thing without ever quite saying the thing directly. And now this, a signature Dorothy hadn't given. I drove to Dorothy's house after school. I hadn't called ahead. She came to the door before I had a chance to knock, as though she'd been watching for me, which she probably had. She had an uncanny sense of when I was coming. Come in, she said, already stepping back. We sat at the kitchen table in the late afternoon light. I told her what the real estate agent had said, and then I said, "There is a power of attorney document filed in your name." She looked at me for a long moment. "I did not sign a power of attorney," she said. "I have not signed any such document. Not for Richard. Not for anyone." "I know," I said. "I need you to understand that completely," she said, not with urgency, with precision. "I am telling you this as a fact. I did not sign it." "I know," I said again. "I believe you. Margaret needs to hear you say it tomorrow, and she'll believe you too. And then we need to find out what document exists and who signed it." Dorothy was quiet for a moment. Outside, Agnes could be heard moving around her garden. The sound of a trowel, the occasional murmur of something addressed to a plant. That small, ordinary sound of a neighbor going about her evening. "He forged my signature," Dorothy said. It was not a question. She said it the way she said things she had already understood and was now speaking aloud for the record. "That's what we're going to find out," I said. "He forged my signature," she said again, more quietly, looking at her hands on the table. And then she looked up. "All right," she said. "Let's deal with it." Margaret had, by the time we arrived the following morning, already pulled the records. There was a power of attorney document on file, filed 6 weeks earlier, signed in Dorothy's name, notarized by a man named Gerald Pratt. Margaret knew the name. She knew it from other work she'd encountered in the field, work that had touched the orbit of Richard's property management company in a way she hadn't been able to put a clean line under until now. The notarization had been done without an independent attorney present. The witness signatures were two people she couldn't immediately identify. Dorothy looked at the document for a long time. Her hands were still. The room was very quiet. Margaret's office was always quiet. It had that quality of places where serious things are handled. A muffled, deliberate hush. "That is not my signature," Dorothy said. The words landed in the room the way certain words land, with a weight that spreads outward from them. "That is not my signature," she said again, with a firmness that was its own kind of authority. "I have not signed any document relating to this property in many years. Not since your grandfather's estate, and that was 15 years ago." I looked at the signature on the document. I had seen my grandmother's signature many times. The signature on the document was wrong in the way that a very good forgery is wrong. Close enough to fool someone who didn't know the original well, but with the subtle wrongness of something rendered rather than expressed. The rhythm was off. The particular way she formed the D in Dorothy, with a slight loop at the top that was entirely her own. It was almost right. Almost. Close enough to pass a casual inspection. Not close enough to pass mine. "We need a document examiner," Margaret said, "and we need to file a report with the county, freezing any further action on the property. The listing agent needs to receive a formal notice, and—" She paused and her voice became very even. "This is criminal fraud. I want to be clear about that. Forging someone's signature on a power of attorney document is a felony. Filing a forged document with the county is a separate felony. We have options about how to proceed, and we should discuss them carefully." Dorothy sat very still in her good chair, in her good earrings, with her hands folded in her lap. I could see, because I knew her face, the thing moving behind it. Not fear, not distress. Something older and harder. Something that had been building for a long time and was now finally arriving at its proper name. "I see," she said. "Dorothy," Margaret said gently. "I need to ask, do you want to file a criminal complaint?" Dorothy was quiet for a long moment. "I want to understand my options," she said. "I want to understand the consequences of each option, and then I want to make a decision." "Of course," said Margaret. They talked for a long time. I listened. Dorothy asked questions, specific, precise questions about process, timeline, likely outcomes, what it would mean for her family, what it would mean publicly, what exactly could be proven, and how. She listened to the answers with the same attentiveness she brought to everything, and when she had all the information, she sat quietly for a moment and then said, "Not yet." She wanted the option preserved. She wanted Richard to know the option existed, but she did not, at this moment, want to file. "I want to try the direct approach first," she said. "I want to look him in the face, and then I'll decide." I called my father from the parking lot of Margaret's building. He picked up on the first ring. Something in the way I started the sentence, I don't know what quality it had, but he knew immediately, made him absolutely silent while I talked. When I finished, he said nothing for a moment. Then, he forged her signature. "That's what the examiner will determine formally. He forged her signature," my father said again, and in the repetition there was something that was not quite grief and not quite anger, but existed somewhere between them, in the space you reach when someone you've known for 60 years does something that requires you to revise your entire understanding of who they are. My father had never been the kind of man who updated his understanding of people easily. It required evidence, and now there was evidence. I could hear him updating. "I'll be there," he said. "Whatever you need, I'll be there." The document examiner was a retired forensic specialist from the state crime lab named Dr. Haverford. He was gray-haired and methodical and conducted his examination over the course of a week with the air of someone for whom precision is not a professional habit, but a form of respect for truth. His report was delivered on a Thursday afternoon and was 16 pages long and unambiguous. The signature on the power of attorney was not Dorothy Holt's signature. He could demonstrate this through multiple characteristics: pen pressure, stroke sequence, relative letter dimensions, the specific way she formed the letters D, H, and L, which he had analyzed against 6 known genuine samples from documents over a 30-year period. He stated his confidence level. He stated this not boastfully, but factually, the way you state something that is simply, verifiably true. Richard, in the meantime, had called Dorothy twice more in the weeks since my call to Daniel Archer. He was moving the timeline. He had, he said, found a wonderful buyer who needed to close quickly. Things were moving fast. Wasn't that exciting? The buyer was motivated. A quick close would maximize the proceeds. She'd have real peace of mind. She'd be financially comfortable. He'd take care of everything. Dorothy answered these calls with perfect composure and reported back to me with perfect accuracy. She said things like, "Oh my," and "Is that right?" and "I'll have to think about that." She was, she told me after the second call, quite tired of saying she'd have to think about it. "I hope we can move soon," she said. "I am ready to have this over with." Patricia called me separately on a Thursday evening. Her voice was warm and bright in the particular way it got when she was managing something she'd decided she could manage. "Ellie, I've been meaning to reach out. How are you, sweetheart?" I told her I was well. I was standing in my kitchen, the window above my sink dark with the fall evening, and I kept my voice entirely pleasant while every part of my attention went cold and focused. "We've been thinking so much about Dorothy," she said. "Richard has found her such a wonderful opportunity. I know change can feel scary, but honestly, when you see these communities up close, they're gorgeous. She'll have people her own age, activities, so much support, so much. Not rattling around in that old house on her own." She paused. "We all just want what's best for her." That's so thoughtful of you both, I said. And I know you're very close with her. Patricia continued, her voice warming further, softening at the edges. I know you might have concerns, but this is a good thing, really. The market timing is exceptional. Richard has done all the research. The buyer is wonderful. It's all coming together so smoothly. Another pause, and in the pause I felt her calibrating, deciding how much to ask for directly. I just wanted to make sure you're not worried, that you understand this is right for her. You'll talk to her? Help her see that this is the right move? I'll have a conversation with her, I said. Wonderful. She trusts you so much. It'll make such a difference coming from you. After I hung up, I stood in my kitchen for a long time. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside, a dog barked and then stopped. I thought about Patricia's voice, the practiced brightness of it, the warmth deployed like a tool, the way she'd said, rattling around in that old house with the faintest emphasis, as if the house were a burden Dorothy would be relieved to be rid of rather than a home she had chosen and tended and loved for 53 years. I thought about what it would take to look at an 81-year-old woman's life and see primarily a real estate transaction. I called Margaret. The buyer was in place, the timeline was accelerating. We needed to be ready. We set a meeting for the following Friday, ostensibly to discuss, as Richard had been calling it, the transition. He called Dorothy to confirm. She confirmed in her most pleasant voice. He didn't know that Margaret Osei would be present. He didn't know my father would be there. He didn't know about Dr. Haverford's report, filed and certified the previous week. He didn't know that Daniel Archer had already quietly removed 44 Sycamore Lane from his active listings, following a conversation with the county clerk's office that had apparently been quite clarifying. He didn't know that the transfer of the property 6 months earlier meant there was nothing left to sell. He also didn't know that the meeting would be recorded, with Dorothy's knowledge and full consent, on a device in my jacket pocket. I barely slept the night before. I lay in the dark and ran through scenarios and thought about what could go wrong and what could not go wrong, and came back, again and again, to Dorothy sitting across her kitchen table from me in the June light, saying I intend to leave it to my granddaughter. I thought about the forged D. I thought about Patricia taking photographs of the exterior for memories while the real estate agent made notes on his clipboard. I thought about all the warm phone calls and the careful positioning and the gradual pressure, and I thought about Dorothy fielding all of it alone, for months before she called me. Not because she hadn't needed help sooner, but because she'd wanted to be certain she understood what she was dealing with before she brought anyone else into it. Around 4 in the morning, I got up and made tea and sat at my kitchen table in the dark. The streetlights made orange rectangles on my floor. I thought about what my grandmother had said, once, about her own mother. She was a woman who knew the difference between what could be tolerated and what could not, and she never confused the two. I had always understood that as description. I understood it now as instruction. I dressed carefully in the morning. Not formally. I didn't want to signal anything, but with the kind of deliberateness that is itself a form of readiness. I drove to Sycamore Lane and arrived 20 minutes early and sat with Dorothy at the kitchen table while she drank her morning tea with complete equanimity. "How are you feeling?" I asked. "I'm well," she said. I slept well. I was thinking last night about the garden. I want to try a different variety of tomato next year, the ones that do better in this climate. She held her teacup in both hands. I've been looking forward to this morning, actually. Have you? It's been a long time coming, she said simply. My father arrived at 9:30 in his good jacket and kissed his mother's cheek and sat down without a word and looked at her for a moment with an expression I'd never seen before, something between pride and a grief that knew better than to dwell on itself. Margaret Osei arrived at 9:50, set her briefcase on the kitchen table, removed a manila folder from it, and said, "Good morning." "Good morning," Dorothy said. "Can I get you tea?" "Please," said Margaret. Richard and Patricia arrived at 10. Together, Patricia in a new scarf I hadn't seen before, Richard in business casual confidence, moving with the ease of a man who considers himself the most practical person in any room he enters. They came through the front door, Dorothy had left it unlocked, and walked into the kitchen talking about the drive. And then they stopped. 4 of us at the table. A woman they didn't recognize with a briefcase in a very precise manner. Richard's confidence didn't disappear. That would come later. But it flickered, like a light that's been touched. "James," he said, surprised. "I didn't know you were coming." "I know," my father said. Patricia smiled brightly. "What a full house." She said it with warmth and sat down and arranged her scarf. "And this is—" Richard looked at Margaret. "Margaret Osei. I'm Dorothy's attorney." "Oh, how wonderful," Patricia said, with just the right pitch of delight. "It's always good to have someone to look over the paperwork. Good for Dorothy to have representation." "Yes," said Margaret. "It is." I watched Richard's eyes move around the table. He was calculating. I could almost follow it. The rapid inventory of what he knew and what he didn't. What this meant. How to position. He was a man who had spent 20 years negotiating real estate. He believed in his own capacity to navigate. He sat down across from my father and folded his hands on the table and addressed Dorothy with warm concern. And the warmth was real in the way that all of his warmth was real. It was not manufactured, it was genuine, and it coexisted perfectly with everything he had done. And that was perhaps the most unsettling thing about him. He began the way he always began. With context, with care, with the reasonable voice of a man who has done a great deal of research for your benefit. He explained the community he'd found. He explained the market conditions, how exceptional they were at this precise moment, how timing mattered in real estate as in so many things. He explained the buyer, who was motivated and wonderful and ready to close quickly, which would maximize Dorothy's proceeds and set her up beautifully. He explained that Dorothy would have real peace of mind, that she'd be financially comfortable, that he'd handle everything. She wouldn't have to think about a single detail. She could just let him take care of it. He said these things to Dorothy with the full weight of his concern, leaning slightly forward, his voice pitched low and warm and intimate. And I watched Dorothy listen to it all the way through before she spoke. "Richard," she said when he had finished, "the house is not mine to sell." The silence that followed had weight to it. I felt it against my ribs. Richard blinked. "I'm sorry?" "The property was transferred," Margaret said, placing the document on the table before anyone could say another word. "6 months ago, to Eleanor Holt by deed of gift. Recorded with the county clerk's office. I'd encourage you to review it." Richard picked up the document. His face moved through several things in quick succession. Confusion, which I believed was real. Recalculation, which I also believed was real. And then a settling into the particular careful blankness of someone managing a situation that has departed significantly from their expectations. He read, or appeared to read. I suspected he'd understood the content within the first 10 seconds and was now thinking about how to respond to it. Patricia did not speak. She was very still, her hands folded in her lap, her face arranged into a pleasantly interested expression that didn't reach her eyes or her hands or any part of her that I could actually see. "I don't understand," Richard said finally. He set the document down with a deliberateness that was itself a kind of performance. "It's quite clear," Margaret said. "The transfer is legal, documented, and recorded. Any agreement made with you regarding this property, on behalf of Dorothy or otherwise, subsequent to that transfer date, is without legal basis and is void." Richard looked at Dorothy. "Why didn't you tell me?" And now the warmth had a new quality. Something underneath it harder. Not anger, not yet. But the pressure of someone who has realized the ground has shifted and is still deciding what to do about it. "Because," Dorothy said, with a mildness that was also a door closing, "it was not your business." "Dorothy." The appeal in his voice was genuine, I think. "I've been trying to take care of you. Everything I've done has been about what's best for you. The house is too large, the upkeep. Everything you've done," Dorothy said, "has been about this house." The sentence fell into the room like something dropped from a height. Richard opened his mouth and closed it. Patricia touched his arm with her fingertips. A signal or a warning. I wasn't sure which. The kitchen was very still. Outside the window, the back garden was bright in the morning light. The tomatoes already past their season, but the garden still full. Still itself. "We have another matter to discuss," Margaret said. She placed Dr. Haverford's report on the table. A power of attorney document bearing Dorothy's signature was filed 6 weeks ago. The document has been examined by a forensic document specialist. His finding is that the signature is not Dorothy's. She paused. "This is a felony, Richard. Filing a forged document with the county is a separate felony. I want you to understand exactly what we're talking about." The kitchen was so quiet I could hear the clock on the wall. I could hear the neighbor's wind chime, faint and clear from 2 doors down. I watched Richard look at the document without touching it, and I watched his face very carefully because I was looking for what was real underneath the performance. What I found, after the calculation, after the management, a man who had believed he was being practical, who had convinced himself that he was acting in his mother's interest, who had made a serious miscalculation and was now staring at its consequences. I didn't think he'd told himself he was stealing. I thought he'd told himself a story in which this was practical, inevitable, a kindness she didn't know she needed. I thought he'd told himself that story until it had become internally true. That didn't make what he'd done less wrong. It made it, in some ways, harder. Because a person who knows they're doing wrong is simpler than a person who has convinced themselves they're doing right. "That's a serious allegation," he said. His voice was very controlled. "It's a serious finding," Margaret said. Patricia stood up. "I think we should—" "Sit down, Patricia," my father said. He said it quietly. Without anger, without anything, in fact, except the simple directness of someone who has reached the end of his patience so completely that there's nothing on the other side of it but clarity. Patricia looked at him. She sat down. Richard put his hands flat on the table. "I want to be clear that my intentions have always been to protect Dorothy's interests. If there was a document that was processed incorrectly—" "Forged," I said. The word came out quietly and cleanly, and it arrived in the room with the specific weight of a word that is exactly right, the word for the thing and not an approximation of it. He looked at me. This was the first time he'd looked at me directly since he'd sat down. He had been addressing Dorothy, addressing my father, addressing Margaret, treating me as a supporting presence. Now he was looking at me. I looked back. "You were going to sell her house," I said, without her knowledge and without her consent, using her forged name to authorize it. "She is 81 years old and she has lived in this house for 53 years, and you were going to sell it and move her to a place she didn't choose because the market conditions were exceptional." I kept my voice even. The evenness cost me something, but I kept it. "You are her son." Something moved in his face. I can't name it precisely. Not shame. I don't think he was capable of shame in that moment, surrounded and seen and managed. But something adjacent to it. Something that recognized the words without being willing to receive them fully. "The market," he started. "I don't care about the market," I said. "I have never cared about the market. I care about her." Margaret placed the agreement on the table. She explained it in clear, precise terms. Richard would withdraw all pending arrangements, representations, and contacts related to the property. He would confirm in writing that he had no authority over any aspect of Dorothy's property or finances. He would agree not to initiate further contact with real estate agents, financial institutions, or any other parties on Dorothy's behalf. In exchange, Dorothy would decline to file a criminal complaint at this time, a phrase Margaret emphasized with the even-handedness of someone who wants the emphasis to be unmistakable. Richard read the document. Patricia read over his shoulder. The morning light moved through the kitchen windows. I kept my hands still in my lap. My father watched his brother read. "Richard," my father said, when Richard had finished reading and not yet moved. "Just the name. Nothing else. 60 years in one syllable." Richard picked up the pen Margaret had placed on the table and signed the document. He didn't look up when he did it. Patricia did not sign. She was not named in it. But she had stopped speaking and she did not start again. At the door, Richard stopped. He turned back and looked at Dorothy for a moment. Just looked, without strategy, without warmth, without calculation. Just an old man who had done something that could not be undone and was standing with the full weight of that. "Dorothy?" he said. My grandmother looked at him with those clear, quiet eyes that had seen 60 years of him and loved him and understood him and had never, not for a single moment, been confused about who he was. She looked at him for a long moment. "Go home, Richard," she said. He went. Patricia followed without a word, her scarf trailing, and the front door closed behind them. The four of us stayed in the kitchen. Dorothy picked up her tea, which had gone cold, and drank some of it anyway. My father put his hand over his mother's and left it there. Margaret closed her briefcase with a small, precise click. Outside, the garden held the morning light. Somewhere in Agnes's yard, a dahlia shook lightly in the wind. "Shall I make fresh tea?" Dorothy said. "Yes," my father said. "Please." The legal resolution took months. Careful, methodical months, conducted almost entirely through attorneys with minimal direct contact. Richard and Patricia hired a lawyer who communicated with Margaret and only with Margaret. They did not contest the deed transfer. They could not, it was ironclad, recorded, witnessed, notarized, and 6 months old. They did not ultimately face criminal charges. Dorothy had considered the option carefully over several weeks and decided that the prolonged spectacle of prosecution was not what she wanted. "I've made my point," she said. "The point is made. I have no interest in dragging things further than they need to go." The signed agreement, Margaret confirmed, was legally enforceable. Dr. Haverford's report remained on file. If anything like this was ever attempted again, the complaint would be automatic. My father stopped having Tuesday phone calls with Dorothy and began visiting in person every Tuesday instead. He'd arrive with food from the Italian place she liked, and they'd have dinner together. And he'd fix whatever needed fixing. And they'd talk or sit in companionable quiet with the ease of people who have known each other long enough to be comfortable in silence. I asked him once, weeks later, how he felt about Richard. He was quiet for a while and then said, "He's my brother. That will always be true. What he did will always be true too. I don't know how to hold both those things together yet, but I expect I'll work it out eventually. I've worked out harder things." He paused. "I should have spoken up sooner. I knew something was wrong. I should have named it instead of finding other explanations. That's mine to carry." I told him it wasn't his fault. He said that was kind but incomplete. Richard and Patricia did not come to Christmas that year. A card arrived in Patricia's handwriting. A nice card, a seasonal card, deliberately neutral. It arrived every year after that, always in her handwriting, always arrived on time. Nothing else. Agnes from next door organized a small party the following spring, ostensibly a dahlia planting celebration, actually a celebration of Dorothy. And everyone knew it, including Dorothy, who wore a yellow dress and looked better than she had in years. I stood on Agnes's porch and watched Dorothy in the garden below, talking to Agnes's grandchildren about dahlias with the same engaged attention she brought to everything young, everything learning, everything starting. I thought, she did this herself. She saw what was coming and she moved toward it before it could arrive at her door. She called an attorney. She put on her good blue coat and signed the papers. She sat in her kitchen and looked her son in the eye and told him to go home. She is 81 years old and she is extraordinary, and the house on Sycamore Lane is exactly where she will stay. 2 years after that morning, almost to the day, I was helping Dorothy plant tomatoes in the back garden. We were on our knees in the good dark soil. The morning cool turning toward warmth, and she handed me a small plant, and I set it against its stake and pressed the soil carefully around it. And she watched my hands the way she used to watch my hands when she was teaching me piano, attentively, with the quiet satisfaction of seeing something done properly. "Ellie," she said. "Thank you." I looked up. She was looking at the garden, not at me. You don't need to thank me, I said. I know I don't need to, she said. I want to. She patted the soil around her own plant with the flat of her hand. I could have handled it without you. I want you to understand that. I'm not thanking you for saving me. I am not a person who needed saving. I know that. I'm thanking you, she said, for being the person I wanted to call. In any difficulty, at any hour, you are the person I wanted to call. That is what I'm thanking you for. I held the small green plant for a moment before setting it into the earth. I thought about the deed in the county clerk's office with my name on it. I thought about the forged signature. That D not quite right. The slight wrongness of something rendered rather than expressed. I thought about my grandmother sitting in Margaret Osie's office in her good earrings, saying I intend to leave it to my granddaughter. I have intended this for some years. I pressed the plant into the dark soil and felt the earth cool around my fingers and the spring morning warm on my back. And behind us, the house held all its history in its walls. Wood smoke and something faintly floral, the piano with its stack of beginner's sheet music, the scratch on the kitchen table. 53 years of one woman's life made into a place. I love you, I said. I know that too, she said with her particular mildness that contained a whole warmth beneath it, and handed me another plant. We worked the rest of the morning in the garden, planting in the kind of quiet that doesn't need filling. And when we went inside, the house smelled exactly as it always smelled, and Dorothy set the kettle on and the water began to heat with its small, familiar sound. And I sat at the kitchen table where I had sat every Sunday for years and felt the morning coming through the window and understood, finally and fully, what it meant that this table was still here. This window, this smell, this woman moving easily around this kitchen. Understood it not as a relief, but as something larger and quieter than relief. The property at 44 Sycamore Lane is mine on paper. It will always be Dorothy's in every way that matters. Agnes still grows dahlias with competitive ferocity. My father visits every Tuesday. The handrail on the back porch is solid and painted white. I drink tea at that table every Sunday morning. It doesn't taste bitter. It never did.